Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A fellow at the Hoover Institution and professor of economics at the New York University Business School, Michael Spence is a winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize for Economics. His latest book, The Next Convergence, The Future of Economic Growth in a Multi-Speed World. Michael Spence, welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
The history of growth, Mike. Let me quote to you from The Next Convergence. In 1750, most people would probably have said that the pre-industrial configuration of the world's economy was largely a permanent state of affairs, that the world had always been like that and probably always would be, and they would have had the facts on their side. Explain.
Well, we know from the historian Agus Madison, that who studied as best we can with the data we have, Peter, that economic growth, for a lot of centuries, say starting when we can count in the year 1000, was essentially negligible. Most countries were the same. Most countries consisted of poor people with a few rich people who were powerful. Inter-country differences weren't that big. The Ming Dynasty in China was a bit, higher income than most of Europe, but the differences by our standards were small. So that was the way life was.
And what happened around 1750?
Around 1750, we had the British Industrial Revolution, an inflection point in the kind of economic history of the world.
That really does stand up. There's no revisionists. That is a big moment, and everybody knows it.
Yeah. No, there's just a kink in the pattern of growth and all the things that went with it. The use of scientific knowledge and technology to create economic value. And the interesting thing is that the Malthus effect, which is population will grow to eat up all of the incremental income, didn't actually happen either. And so per capita income started to rise.
Mm-hmm. And then you talk about a multi-speed world. Mm-hmm. So phase one, no growth.
Right.
Phase two, what we would now term the West, grows.
Starts to grow.
Now we come to the next point that you're talking about in this book. Again, I'm quoting to you from the next Convergence. The snapshot picture of the world economy in 1950 was the result of that remarkable 200 years of economic history, a breakout period for the minority of the world's population. Starting after World War II, the pattern shifted again. The countries in the developing world started to grow. At first, it was relatively slow and in isolated countries. Then it began to spread and accelerate. This sounds pretty straightforward. The rest of the world is finally catching up. It's simple. We should rejoice. Right?
Yes. I mean, on balance, yes.
How did it happen?
The colonial empires fell apart, and we arguably had built-in asymmetries in them. One would have guessed, I think incorrectly, that there were cultural differences holding these countries back. Some inherent defect that I don't think that's turned out to be true. So colonialism fell apart. We had a bunch of new countries that were finding their identity, finding a governance structure that worked. It was chaotic and a mess. And then the other key ingredient, two actually. Mm-hmm. One, very wise people led by Americans decided not to repeat the aftermath of World War I, to crush the vanquished and create a situation that led to another war. Instead, we built up the vanquished. We worked through the Marshall Plan on rebuilding Europe. We worked on restoring Japan. We opened the global economy so that these economies became permanently interconnected. And when we did that, Peter, we probably didn't know that the long-run beneficiaries were going to be these poor countries whose future we didn't really know. In fact, they're countries that we called backward.
Right.
Not developing, not emerging, backward. And there are a bunch of other terms that I refer to on the way through in this journey. But that once they figured out a way to connect to the global economy, third key ingredient, so you have colonialism goes away, they're not held down. Mm-hmm. You've got opening of the global economy through the GATT and a set of policies that really just turn out, with the benefit of hindsight, to be A, generous, and B, really farsighted. And the third one is technology. I mean, you can fly on airplanes, the cost of transportation went down, communication costs went down. The tools that you use to integrate a global economy were being built and then used.
Okay. I want to return to a little bit of economic theory and talk about technology in a moment, but I want to make sure. So the United States, there's a distinctively American piece of that story, which is to say that after the Second World War, the United States, measured as a proportion of world domestic output, is at a position of dominance that constantly continues to recede.
Right.
And the United States lets it happen.
Yes.
Indeed, seems to welcome the growth of other countries. So now you're a Canadian, I know. You're raised in Canada and you live in Italy, but Americans ought to be proud of that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much. Just want to establish that.
Absolutely.
Tender moment for Americans as the economy wobbles. We'll get back to all that, but I'd like to note that there's one moment of which we can be unambiguously proud. Segment 2, closer look at growth. The next convergence, again, since the Industrial Revolution began, incomes and productivity keep rising. So the obvious question is, where does that come from? The short answer is innovation. Where does innovation come from? What do you mean? What does someone who thinks rigorously about these questions mean when he says innovation? And where does he think that comes from?
It comes from entrepreneurs who figure out better ways to do things or lower cost ways to do things. And the theory of modern endogenous growth theory is developed by Paul Romer here at Stanford, Philippe Aghion, Bob Lucas, and others, was to take the Bob Solow model, which established clearly that innovation was the only way to sustain long-term growth because you can't capital deepen an economy forever.
Hold on, that's a very important concept, I think. I want to make sure that I've got it.
Yeah.
In an economy of this size, there are so many people, their labor, and there's so much capital.
Right.
And to begin with, you can make pretty good progress by pouring more capital on top of labor, giving them more machines. But eventually you run out of capital.
The returns to the incremental investment fall.
So the innovation lies in combining labor and capital more and more cleverly, doing new things, finding new ways of mixing them. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
It shows up in cost reductions. It shows up in new companies. It shows up in new products that help us do things that we couldn't do or do things that we do better. It shows up in iPads and iPods and, computers and networks and all kinds of things, more efficient cars, just hundreds of things. And what the theory of modern endogenous growth theory did was to explain there's enough incentives for people to invest in these technologies, even though the next technology will kill it off. This is Schumpeter's creative destruction. So you have a continuous process of creation, and then the next creation, that kills it off is a bit strong, but, takes away part of the future, and the next one takes that one away, and that turns out to work. This is the dynamics of a competitive capitalist system.
And what we've learned in the last few decades is that it is not distinctive to the Western world.
No, it's not. That's right. I mean, it is spreading rapidly as countries who used to be in the developing category approach our size. They start to act like us and innovate, and they become part of this multi-country ecosystem. When we don't innovate for the United States, we innovate for everybody, and the Europeans innovate for everybody. We collectively innovate, and that generates growth.
Until recently, you explained in the next convergence, the Western discussion of the developing world. What's the correct term for it anyway? I mean, it used to be third world. That makes no sense. Developing world. It's almost impossible to find one that.
It's a moving target.
Yeah, Peter. It is. All right.
It's okay. No, developing world's still pretty good. Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs, who invented the term BRICS, is now telling us that we can't use it emerging anymore because the big developing countries aren't emerging anymore. They've emerged.
Right, right. Okay.
BRICS
is Brazil. BRICS is Brazil. Can you remember all?
Oh, sure. Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Okay. So anyway, quote, the implicit assumption appears to be that, you say that the Western discussion has tended to focus on our interaction with the developing world. Quote, the implicit assumption appears to be that these external interactions are the principal catalysts for change. This is an incomplete and somewhat narcissistic view. So it's not what we do to them. But at the same time, you said a moment ago that the openness of the world trading system is critical. So what's taking place in these developing countries that is specific and internal to them?
Well, they start out in a relatively poor state. They have to get everybody together. This is the function of leadership, and say, look, they're in a sort of low-level, low-growth equilibrium. The leadership, wherever they comes from, has to get everybody together, labor, the business community, the agricultural sector, whatever else is there, and say, look, we're going off on a new path. And here's the vision of what it looks like. It's a long journey. We don't know. And it's going to involve long time horizon, short-term sacrifice. We're going to have to invest at high levels. And we're going to have to open ourselves to the global economy, which will carry very big benefits, but some costs in terms of risk, volatility, being buffeted. That wouldn't happen if we were closed. And the countries that manage to take that approach and get the investment levels up high enough to drive the growth, then set off on this journey.
And you contrast in the new Convergence North Korea and South Korea, which half a century ago had about the same GDP of a little over $1 a day. And now the GDP in South Korea is about $20,000 a year.
Right.
And the GDP in North Korea is about $1 a day, right where it's been.
Exactly.
And then here is, in some ways to me, this was the most stunning quotation in the whole book. Quote, this is you, quote, "When I started studying growth in the developing world, I thought the subject was mainly about economics. I no longer believe that." Explain that, Mike.
I think that what I thought was sort of complicated high-speed dynamics in the economic sphere turns out to be only a piece of the puzzle. And what I really believe now is that the critical things are the governance, the interaction of economics and politics, the policy-making process, the wisdom with which it's conducted, the intent to help all the citizens in the country as opposed to grab as much as you can for yourself. When I go across the developing countries and ask myself, what's the largest single explanation for the huge diversity of economic performance, it falls in this territory.
All right. Segment 3, China. Mao and the communists take control of the country in 1948. You got a very poor country with a lot of people being killed. And in 1979, something changes. Tell us what changes.
Mao is dead. The Gang of Four is in prison and I guess executed. And Deng Xiaoping was a very smart, well-educated peasant like Mao. And a few of his colleagues get up and they say, we're going to lose the whole thing. And what they meant, of course, is the Communist Party will lose its credibility if we keep up this poor performance in economic terms with no noticeable real benefits in the lives of people. I mean, it was compounded by the Great Leap Forward where, 10 to 20 to 30 million people starved.
The numbers are staggering.
Staggering. The Cultural Revolution, which really wasn't economic, but and they said, look, they were pragmatic. They said, we have to do something different. This centrally planning business isn't working. It hasn't worked anywhere else either. We have to use markets and create a certain amount of economic freedom for people to act. We have to let market incentives operate because people are just not, they're producing to quota or something like that. And we have to open up. We have to start learning from the rest of the world. And so they did both of those things with in the end,
results.
Just spectacular.
Let me try a quotation, a chestnut of a quotation from Adam Smith on you, Mike. Quote, "Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice." Close quote. One of Milton Friedman's favorites, as you know.
Yeah.
Is that what it comes down to in China? That the government just got off people's backs? That it got out of the way? In other words, with China, from this country, it's constantly back. To what extent are they simply engaging in the kind of economics of which Milton Friedman would have approved? They're just getting out of the way and letting markets operate. And to what extent are they instead directing this economy, making choices about capital allocation? To what extent is it in some way still a command economy?
It's a hybrid. They adopted the market system and appreciated what it does and the dynamic, and they opened it up. So they get the benefit of entrepreneurs creating new companies. They get the benefit of export-led growth. They get the benefit of multinationals coming in to produce things and eventually hope to sell them in this growing large market, and all the technology and know-how transfer that goes with that foreign direct investment process. They got all that right. So a very large part of this story is getting out of the way, given the starting point. But there's another component, which is governments invest in things that the private sector tends to underinvest in. Education, human capital, infrastructure. And China is a star performer because the government has a huge balance sheet, a gigantic access to resources, which they, of course, can misuse if they so choose. But they chose to at least deploy some of those assets in not falling behind and creating the complementary assets that increase the returns to the private sector investment and let the engine run.
And where did the intellectual framework for all of this come from? Did Deng Xiaoping say in 1979, wow, we'd better get some of our best students over to MIT and study up on Western economics? It doesn't seem to have been the case, does it? They've gotten an amazing amount right on their own. Is that right?
One of my friends went with McNamara to China. McNamara was then the head of the World Bank.
Right, Robert McNamara.
Yeah, Robert McNamara. And at Deng Xiaoping's request, and Deng Xiaoping sat them down, and he said, we're embarking on this new course. It's more promising. To be honest with you, we don't know much about running a market economy and managing it. And you're a bank, but we don't think we mainly need money. We save at a pretty high rate here. But what we need is knowledge. We need knowledge in everything. And so would you please help us with that? And the World Bank set about to bring, the leading figures in economics from the United States around the world. Milton Friedman, James Tobin, not people from all over the political spectrum, to give lectures, to teach them what they knew, so they could start this long journey of learning how to manage an economy in transition.
The next convergence. Meeting the challenge of the domestic restructuring to sustain growth and asserting the right to develop and not be penalized purely for being large are major new mountains for China to climb. Close quote. Penalized for being too large. Is that what you're talking about there is the international green lobby? You're not allowed to produce greenhouse gases?
Yeah, that's part of it. But the other one, I think the more fundamental point, but there is a disadvantage in that. There's also an advantage I've discovered since writing the book, but we'll come to that later. No, China has a per capita income now as a result of 31 years of high-speed growth of $4,000, less than a tenth of ours. But it's a heck of a lot better than $400, which is where they started. And they're growing very rapidly. But because of the sheer size of the country in terms of population, they're now the second largest economy in the world, if you don't count Europe as one. They just went past Japan. And what they do has a significant external effects. They are systemically important. This has never happened before to a country with a per capita income of $4,000. Smaller countries like Japan get to be systemically important when they get to $20,000. Way further down the line.
So by systemically important, you mean the price of oil is up because of China.
Yep.
The price of rare earth metals all over the world is up because China.
Right.
That's what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
And financial stability. If they misstep with their $3 trillion worth of reserves, they'll destabilize.
We will all feel it.
Yeah. So they know this. But so now they have a tension. We're still not a rich country, measured in per capita income. And there's domestic forces that, opinions that say, well, let's just still pay attention to our domestic growth and development. It's pretty complicated, we'll keep us busy. And then the other group inside China is saying, well, look, and outside China, people who are sympathetic and want this whole enterprise to succeed, say, look, it would be nice if you had the luxury to do that, but you don't. It's not even in your interest to ignore the external effects. So actually you have to accept these as responsibilities. You have to be part of the process through the G20 of managing the global economy. And you have to make policy decisions with an eye to their external effects. And
your general sense of it is that they are being responsible, that they are welcoming or at least learning to live with these.
Yes. It's a learning curve. I mean, this is something you learn to do over time increasingly effectively. You don't get up one morning and say, I understand the global economy.
As you know, here's the other question at some level in the back of every American's mind, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the Soviet Union in the old days and 1 being Canada, where is China? Enemy, friend, adversary of some kind?
Yeah, I would say 8.
You would?
8 toward friend. I mean, we're not so totally aligned. Yeah.
All right.
Our interests and theirs are aligned better than most people think from reading newspapers.
Segment 4, India, the new convergence. India is about 14 years behind China. China's growth jumped up in the late 1970s, while India's growth accelerated in the late 1980s. China grew because the supreme leader, Deng Xiaoping, said, we're going to grow. Why did India begin to grow?
It was a more gradual. I mean, I admire the leaders in India who've engineered this, particularly the current prime minister and the people who've worked with them. They had a system that was malfunctioning, xenophobic on the economic sense, overly managed, not as bad as central planning, but way too big a state sort of sense of control. And they just slowly dismantled the apparatus. A friend of mine who worked with Manmohan Singh all the way through this said, there's 2 aspects to reform. The first thing is the thing that Milton used to talk about. You got to get the government out of the way.
Right.
If it's in the way, and let the private sector run, and they've been doing that. And it's just harder. It takes a little longer in the world's most complicated democracy.
Democracy, you just said the word. China unambiguously has put economic growth ahead of democracy. I have heard over and over again from Chinese friends, of whom there are people in and out of Stanford University from China a lot, as you know very well.
I do.
And so if I had a nickel for every time I've heard this, I could retire. We can't do it now. But in 50 years, we'll be a democracy. Do you hear that as well? All right. India already is a democracy. And it's a great, big, messy democracy. They had no choice. They're stuck with democracy. What's the right model there? If you're Russia, and you say, "Woo, we tried democracy," do you feel some sympathy for Putin? Is the example of China state control, free markets, growth, versus India, democracy, and you got to fumble around for a decade and a half before you even begin to get in gear? Is this bad news about democracy?
No.
Okay, why not?
No, the way I put it is, look, there's trade-offs. It probably is true that if you have an autocracy that is reasonably competent and smart and benign, that is acting as if it were a democracy, at least in some dimensions, on behalf of the people, then it probably can move faster if it knows what it's doing. On the other hand, it's more dangerous. If they don't know what they're doing or they don't care about the people, they can go off and, without really any constraints. So people just put different values on these things. A democracy is safer, probably a bit slower. But the truth is, in the long run, they can both get the job done.
All right. It's almost a commonplace to say that China's getting infrastructure right. You go to the new airport in Beijing, or you just watch the Beijing Olympics, all these spectacular highways and Olympic state. Whereas India, to get from the airport into downtown Delhi, you've got to get in a pedal cart, it seems, almost these days still. That the infrastructure, why is that?
China understood the importance of infrastructure, and because of the history, the taking over of all the country's assets, they inherited the situation where the state had a gigantic balance sheet, and by and large, they've deployed that asset to tremendously good effect. So India is the more normal case. Most countries struggle to find the resources to deliver, in a poor country, to deliver enough services to keep the people in the country going and invest. And there's, obviously, if we're talking about long time horizons and people are poor and have immediate needs, the democratic process puts pressure tends to squeeze out the investments.
Right.
That the Chinese, in some sense, never really were forced to make that choice.
The Chinese are not overinvested in infrastructure?
Maybe a little bit.
But only a little.
Yeah, I mean, people say that a country that's run the investment rate up to 45% of GDP must have some inefficiency in there, and even if they don't know exactly what it is, and there's some truth to that, but they've done an awful lot of good.
Okay. Another commonplace, innovation.
Yeah.
It's said over and over again, all right, fine. If we here in Silicon Valley design an iPod, China will build a city to manufacture it. But they can't design an iPod of their own. This gets to this whole question. This is the one place where the question of culture still seems to come up again and again. Whereas India, you get the feeling that at the very top levels of education, they're turning out really top-flight engineering talent, that there's some openness to entrepreneurial activity, that in various places in India there are little sort of nascent Silicon Valleys of their own springing up. A, is that correct? And B, why should it be? Is there some cultural component to growth here, to innovation specifically?
Yeah, I doubt it.
I doubt it. You do.
Yeah, I think it's. I think the entrepreneurs respond to the large opportunities in their environment, and they're a little different in the two environments. So there's a lot of successful entrepreneurs, but they've sort of taken advantage of the supply chain opportunities and what was there. But to be honest with you, on the journey to advanced country status, I think both of these countries are going to be major innovative forces.
You do?
Yeah, I do.
If we could create two index funds, Mike, actually, I'm sure index funds of the kind I'm about to describe exist.
Yeah.
And one is just a straight index fund on GDP per capita in China 15 years from now. You invest today and you get it out in 15 years. And the other is an index fund on GDP per capita in India. Which one would you invest in?
Both.
All right, fair answer.
Yeah.
Fair answer.
No, just because on diversification, I think they both have a very good chance of sustaining the growth.
You do?
I do. I really do. So
the 9% growth rate in China is sustainable over a decade and a half? Really?
At least a decade, I think. They'll slow it down on purpose. The 12th five-year plan that passed in March and is the operating game plan for the economy, and the new leadership team coming in set it at 7%. What they're doing is they're buying space, if you like, to devote to the rising challenge of income and other kinds of inequality, and to sustainability issues, natural resources, environment, energy, efficiency. So they think those are important, that they'll slow themselves down in order to achieve those objectives.
Segment 5, what it means for us. The next convergence. This is also a pretty compelling quotation, I think. Got my attention, let's put it that way. Currently, the EU and the USA together account for 60% of G20 income, G20 being the 20 most industrialized countries.
No, it's the 20 largest countries. It includes the big emerging markets.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that correction. By the middle of the 21st century, the output of China and India will account for almost 60%. The United States and Europe by then will each account for 10%. It will be a very different world in terms of the distribution of economic power, close quote. Okay, here's the first cut at it. Is the United States today experiencing what Great Britain experienced in the last century?
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, we won't be dominant forever. I think we'll live well. There's no reason to think we won't be competitive. It's not a zero-sum game. I mean, the global GDP will quadruple, and probably in the next 30 years, with China and India and Asia in the lead, causing most of that increase. But if we are on top of our game, look, think of it this way, Peter. Yep. After World War II, we were dominant, and we built up our enemies, and the Europeans are now pretty effective, especially they have great companies that innovate, they compete with our great companies, and we're doing fine in that dimension. Then the Japanese came along, and we were a little scared in certain areas like autos, but, basically they've joined the global economy, and it's bigger. There's room for all of us. And, 20, 30 years from now, we'll have China and India, and we won't be dominant anymore, but we'll be doing fine as long as we educate people, remain innovative, and so on. I find in talking to people that there's a worry that if they win, we'll lose.
Right.
And there is no need for that.
Well, so let me push you a little bit on that. On the economic arena, clearly, if they win, we win. If we win, they win. Everybody gets richer.
Yep.
I'm very happy to have a little extra disposable income because I can buy toys for my kids that were made in China, right? And the prices goes down. Fine. Walmart lives because China has pushed prices down.
Yep.
Everybody's better off. Terrific. But on the military side, it is a gigantic, completely unitary country. They don't, as best I can tell, the leadership in Beijing does make decisions for 1.3 billion people, and they can have a defense budget quickly that places all kinds of pressure on us. I was talking to some Australian friends the other day, and they said, well, Australia, country of 23 or 24 million people, way over there in the Pacific, which right now is doing very well because they're digging things out of the earth and selling them to this country of 1.3 billion. And this is a perfect example. Chinese growth benefiting Australians. But if it comes right down to it, and they say this very jokingly, but only half jokingly, if 50 years from now China decided it wanted Australia, it could just take it. So how do you think about that? How do you put at ease people who get edgy when they try to project their minds 50 years into the future and see the Pacific patrolled by sleek, technologically futuristic Chinese submarines?
Well, don't forget we're going to have two economic giants. And they're between them, in how they interact and how they discharge the responsibilities that go with their size and power, will have a great deal to do with how the rest of us do. And, we can be optimistic or pessimistic or just say we don't know. But it is important there's going to be two of them.
So we place our big geostrategic bets on the Indians.
Well, and the balancing effect.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But I think there's a reasonable if there was only one of them.
You just don't seem concerned by this, Mike.
No, I think I care about the world that my children and grandchildren are going to live in, and if China or India or, God forbid, both of them turned aggressive with respect to the rest of us, once they achieve this position of relative dominance and don't behave the way we've behaved, then there is real trouble, a world of conflict. But even between them, they'll be 20% of the global economy, each of them, and the rest of us will be the other 60. The rest of us, if they got aggressive, would band together.
Okay.
So it may turn. There's one thing I do want to say about this.
Sure.
One of the reasons Asia is resource poor, and they do have a legitimate fear that if they are militarily weak, then in a world of increasing pressure on natural resources, they could get cut off. They're really worried about that. And part of the...
You say resource weak. Oil?
Yeah, just compare it with Africa. Africa's knee-deep in mineral, you name it, and they got it.
Right.
And especially per capita, and Asia tends not to. Japan's the extreme case, but Asia's resource poor. So the Chinese look around and they say, well, we have to be operating from a position of strength, not because we want to be aggressive necessarily, but we can't be weak and vulnerable to being cut off.
Right. Europe, for how to summarize the problems quickly. Slower growth in the United States,
except for
from
Germany.
From the 80s on, say.
Yep.
You've got in France, which is Germany is in the best shape economically. France isn't that bad. It's one of the great pillars of the European Union, and even there, you've had an unemployment rate of 9-10% for some decades now. Among young males, it's 20%, more than 20%.
Yep.
And now, of course, we've got the tremendous pressure on the euro. Greece is fundamentally unproductive, aside from a center of tourism. Will the Germans put all kinds of problems with Europe? Question, will the rise of China and the rise of India set a kind of example? How will Europe, or the United States for that matter, in policy terms, will we respond to these two rising countries?
Well, I think in the American case, let me take the American case because we're at least unified. So we are either going to, my best guess is we'll muddle through and fix the fiscal situation eventually. We will probably cut out some of the sort of growth-oriented, oriented investments on the way through, because that's what you do when you're under, financial stress,
right?
Whether you're a country or a company. But eventually, I think we'll get back to our normal pattern, which is, kind of being pragmatic and investing heavily. We're just underinvesting now, Peter. We're underinvesting in the aggregate. We're underinvesting in crucial things like parts of education in terms of effectiveness and infrastructure and some parts of energy and whatnot. And we're not even saving enough to fund our own investment. That's why we're running a current account deficit. And this is just eventually got to change, or it'll weaken us over time.
Last question. Time magazine founder Henry Luce,
Yes.
famous essay right after the Second World War in which he referred to the 20th century as the American century.
Mm-hmm.
To whom does the 21st century belong?
I think it's more dispersed. I think it'll belong to us and Europe and Asia broadly, East and South. I think we'll be, we're on a journey where we started with the 15%. At the end of World War II, after this 200 years of divergence, to I don't know what it'll be, 75 or 80%, who live like us.
Right.
If we don't destroy the planet on the way through and instead find ways to be less energy intensive and use the resources that we have in a gentler way. But I think we're clever enough to do that. And that's just a world in which there's a dispersion of economic activity and power.
Michael Spence, author of The Next Convergence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.